You know, if there's one question I get asked more than any other, more even than if rabbits don't lay eggs, why does the Easter Bunny deliver them? That question would have to be, Mark, can you make art with a Nikon Coolpix 4500 from 2002? Well, today we're going to try and answer that question.
This is the Nikon Coolpix 4500, and you know what? I think it's gorgeous. As a piece of industrial design, it's bursting with millennial optimism. If you think about it, by the end of the 20th century, the Cold War was over, globalism was on the rise, and there were huge advances in technology, including the internet, and significant social progress in terms of equity and diversity. Of course, none of this lasted. 9/11 happened in 2001, the dot-com bubble was about to burst, and while NSYNC's No Strings Attached may have been the most popular album of 2000, by 2002 they'd marched off into the sunset, their double denim and frosted tips plunged into the silhouette of disillusioned irrelevance. Bye, bye, bye. Still, you can't help but imagine the little techno-pixies at Nikon in 2000, emboldened by this brave new digital world, thinking, hey, why does a camera have to look like a camera? Let's make this smooth, onyx brick of an object that oozes minimalist style and futuristic fervor. I'm sure they had a boardroom meeting about it, but unlike some camera channels, I don't have the inside running on what they were talking about, and my Japanese is pretty much limited to eigo ga wakarimasu ka, so I can only marvel at the inexplicable magic that happened to produce this unique thing. Because you know what? It swivels.
Whoop-de-doo.
Yes, I know it's a small thing, but I have a small mind and a short attention span, so anything that immediately captures my interest like that is a good thing. And actually, it's a very practical device. It's incredibly well built, substantial feeling in the hand at 374 grams, but still small enough to fit in your pocket. Oh, and did I mention it swivels? In that sense, it actually enhances the ergonomics and flexibility of the camera, since you can look down at the LCD and operate it independently of the lens. My pathologically chronic gear acquisition syndrome meant that when I saw a second-hand one for cheap at a local camera market, I had to have it. It does swivel, remember. This copy is missing the trademark red Nikon stripe, which means it probably doesn't go as fast, but then in some markets it came in a nauseating hospital scrubs green colour. So who knows? I'm simply taking the position that a lack of distinctive livery puts me in the same class as those Leica owners who like to cover up their red dot with gaffer tape so that they can seem discreet and play it cool among the proletariat. Of course, none of this means anything now. Surely there's no room for a camera like this in the dystopian 20s. After all, it's got a tiny 4 megapixel sensor, it's slow to start and take pictures before writing them languidly onto a CF card inside. With a tiny LCD and an anemic flash, it's hard to see a value for this now. Or is it? Is it a viable camera, and can you make art with it? Let's find out. Car, I can hear you calling for an abstract photograph. Something to capture the magic of those reflections. And what about that hanging from the rear view mirror? Is that some kind of trophy? So I'm out walking, getting some exercise and trying to make art with a Nikon Coolpix 4500. And you know what? It swivels. On the long path to suburbia, with a couple of crows flying through. Very Edgar Allan Poe. Now, I don't know about you, I'm not a horticulturalist, but I don't think that's real grass. But I do think that this is real. And look, one of the cool things about it is that we can use the screen. So I don't actually have to get down as low. Although I have to say the screen is not very bright. I mean, seriously, who would want to own those things? Really not having very much to say other than, do we have some foliage here? What is that I spy? Is that a star-shaped flower? All right, let's capture this. And I do love how nature just forces its way through. There's a lovely pattern there, but I don't want to capture the area in the sunlight along with the area in the shade. So I think I'll just focus on the area in the shade. Hello Maggies, how are you? Is there something to be had here, I wonder? Perhaps in that light? Shall we do a test for flare and see how it handles some backlit branches? Now just look at that beautiful tree. Perhaps a little bit similar to a paper bark in the way that the bark is kind of white and a bit variegated. Nothing quite like this anywhere else, I'm sure. I find it quite stunning. And certainly something that could classify as art. We're closed till the 15th of the 3rd. So here is our local Chinese restaurant. It seems that perhaps they hadn't paid the rent. The death of the Suburban shopping mall. I'm not quite sure whether they're trying to stop people from using this, but they've obviously put up a barrier, or some kind of ineffective barrier here. Okay. Quite pretty, but the light is really, really harsh. Good test of the dynamic range of the Nikon Coolpix 4500. Now what I'm doing is I'm taking 2 photos just to see a difference the zoom makes. And the temptation when you've got leading lines is to go for a more dramatic wide angle, but it actually doesn't really work here, I don't think. I think I'm better off zooming in because a more interesting feature on the path is the dappled sunlight. Different kinds of vines. Oh, geez, was I still on macro? I don't think I was. No, not macro anymore. slightly backlit. I would normally use exposure compensation, but honestly I can't be bothered. Would that have been better as macro? Seemed to focus okay. Maybe if I get really close. What do we get? Actually, the macro looks pretty good. Interesting. Now I wonder if I can do macro but get kind of a deep perspective running down the length of that tree. That's about as close as it wants me to go with flash. Oh, big hot spot there, I could tell just by looking at it. It wasn't even asking for flash at that point. Quite beautiful geometry, I think, there. Okay, security cameras, which means that I'll probably be on their camera. A photographer taking a photo of a photographer. Very meta. And for good measure. Look, this is just interesting purely from the perspective of recording a suburb. Now, anybody who knows me knows I love a good corrugation, and I love some variegations. I'm going to use the flash for this one because the bell is in the shade and I don't know what that is. A bell of some kind. Whoops. And without killing myself, time for some reflections on the Nikon Coolpix 4500. On the whole, I think it's a great camera. I love the build quality. It feels good in the hand. It has a few niggling issues. One of them in particular is the battery. I hope it's not a problem with the camera and it's just a problem with the battery. Perhaps I didn't charge it, in which case, no harm, no foul. I'll still love you, Nikon Coolpix 4500. But the fact that when I bought this at a camera market, the guy produced 3 extra batteries to give me for free, told me a little bit about this camera. Yes, it sucks juice crazily. And it's all down to this tiny little 1.5-inch LCD, I think. You can turn it off, which does preserve the battery life, but it also has a few negative impacts because, of course, the LCD is where you get to see whether the flash is on, what mode you're in. This doesn't work. That's overheating, hence the truncated section that you heard a little bit before. Can't remember where I was up to, but I will make a few more points about this camera, other than about its capacity to chew batteries. It is a slow camera. Expect significant pause between focus and taking the picture, and also expect the focus to be a little bit uncertain, to wobble a bit before it actually finds its target. All you Blade Runner and Chariots of Fire fans, don't worry. Vangelis does live on, and it looks like he's shaved his beard off. I haven't actually tried the custom modes. It is good from that point of view. The fact that you can have custom modes, you can have aperture, manual, shutter, priority, as well as program, is fantastic in a camera like this. But what are you going to do really? I mean, are you really going to set it to shutter speed mode because you want to capture live action with this thing? Given the fact that there's a delay between pressing the shutter and actually taking the picture, it's not going to capture that goal at the kids' footy match. Similarly with aperture, what are you going to use that aperture for? With a tiny little sensor, I don't think it's going to give you much bokeh unless you're actually going to be shooting in macro mode. So P is the place to be with this camera, I think. And well, my GoPro peed itself again in the hot summer sun, so the place to be is actually back here in the air conditioning. As I was saying, this is actually quite a well tricked out camera in terms of specifications. In fact, the specs list reads longer than a tapeworm, so feel free to pause this video if you really want to do a deep dive into the Nikon Coolpix 4500's vital statistics. The one that really jumps out at me is the price. In 2002, it cost US $700, and adjusting for inflation, that comes to about $5,438,327.47, or maybe about $1,000. Accountancy is not my thing. In any case, this was a high-end device back in the day, and suffice it to say, it has quite a bewildering array of options commensurate with its pedigree, once you start digging into the menu system at least. As I mentioned, you get the standard P, S, A, M and auto options, and you also have a bunch of scene modes to choose from, such as wearing a sun hat, ejaculating confetti, and going to court. Not sure if you're wearing a sun hat and letting off a party popper in a courtroom which one you would pick, but you have the choice. ISO is adjustable all the way to 800, though the very fact that it shows up in red is a pretty good indication that the results will be noisier than a sherbet-fueled toddler's birthday party. But it won't matter anyway because it's not likely to be something that you'll adjust on the fly, simply because all the options are so heavily buried in the menu. Flash is okay, exposure on the whole is smooth and it even does quite a good job with things like skin tones. You'll want to make sure to try not to use the flash closer than 1.6 meters from your subject though. As you can see, the results aren't too pretty when you're too close. One very cool feature is that it does allow for external flash. No hot shoe here, but a sync cable, so believe it or not, you could use this as a studio camera. Yes, I can hear you laughing right now, but it's not actually that crazy when you think about it. The image quality is actually pretty good, honestly. Well, you've seen the pictures, you tell me. To my eyes, the CCD sensor does a great job with colors, and the JPEG processing is so sweet that I really don't see much point in using TIFF. In fact, I can't see any difference in quality between the two. The biggest issue, other than the 4 megapixel resolution and of course poor high ISO performance, is dynamic range. Let's bring up one example and you can see that the highlights just fall off a cliff once you start getting bright. I'd love to say that they're sacrificing themselves at the altar of shadow detail, and look, you can squeeze a little bit more out of the shadows even in JPEG mode, but it's not going to rescue your photos of Black Panther kittens frolicking in snow. Fortunately though, we do now have AI for that. This poor dynamic range is almost forgivable because at least the camera handles chromatic aberration well, and these hotspots don't turn into a mess of green and magenta blobs. So far so good, but you're not here for an exhaustive review of the specifications of a 20-year-old camera, though have I mentioned that this thing actually swivels. Anyway, I suppose now we need to consider the big question. Not does it swivel, but can you make art with a Nikon Coolpix 4500? And of course the answer is yes. I mean, if Jackson Pollock can make art with a paint bucket, I can render the mundanity of suburbia with delicate beauty while hopefully challenging you with the big philosophical questions. Like, what the hell is that? I've made a note to ask the car owner if they wrested it off a fair maiden in a passionate embrace. I just hope they were still alive at the time. But I digress. Art is everywhere. Here we witness the ferocious tenacity of nature as it desperately claws back through the artifice of astroturf, declaring its primacy and right to survive through the oppressive green nylon carpet that is obviously a corollary to the neo-colonialism of the nouveau riche that seeks to stamp out nature and beauty. The inclusion of my foot was obviously a deliberate aesthetic decision, and not just because I was using the optical viewfinder and couldn't see it in the corner of the window. So much going on here, harking back to simpler times perhaps, a time of horses and carts, not Teslas, bells rather than ringtones, ladders perched up against a wall inviting you to scale the man-made topography, celebrate human progress, sure, but perhaps remember too the innocence of childhood, when a cat could be naively stitched from stuffed textile rather than turned into a munted quasi-sentient AI creature with delusions of superhero status. And if there is a better critique of the 21st century than this, you need to let me know. For what is this but an indictment of our surveillance state? Our organic unity has been squashed into formal geometry, casting long shadows over our future, represented here in the bottom right quadrant as the ultimate void. The inky blackness of nothing, and once again totally a deliberate choice rather than simply an artifact of the poor dynamic range of the sensor. For what are we now but pale proxies of human potential, just avatars of our own humanity, destined to live out the script of our predicated banal lives with a fixed smile on our face and wearing a pink unicorn onesie? I mean, seriously, why anyone would have these dumb figurines, I just don't know. And okay, I may be joking a bit, but when I was looking at these pictures, I did see something. I think I've already mentioned my fascination for corrugations and variegations, those great aluminium sine waves that constitute our most common building material, while at the same time we live with and compete against nature. And while I'm not convinced that any of these pictures have any particular individual merit, I do think that documenting the encroach of suburbia and the resilience of nature can make for an interesting series. What's fascinating is that given the state of my current shops, we're possibly losing that battle, or at the very least, we're just one of the variables swarming around in the great petri dish of life. So there's possibly something here, I think. Look, I get it, it's difficult for the untrained eye to fully understand the aesthetic intent going on. I have no doubt that Mondrian's primary school art teacher told him to stop drawing all those bloody squares all the time. If I do need to convince you further, and perhaps I do, then I just ask you to come with me and my Nikon Coolpix 4500 as I go to Sculpture by the Sea, an annual event held on the beaches of a couple of Australian cities. Let me take you to Cottesloe, Western Australia, where we can let this loose on some real art. So there you go, proof positive that if you can't make art out of the bricks and vines of suburban backyards, you can at least render the beauty of real art with the Nikon Coolpix 4500. I did my best, not just to record the sculptures, but to focus on exploring how they interacted with the environment. Let's pick 6 favourites from the 4 megapixel flock. We already know that these are award-worthy works that question the relationship between humanity and nature and the great suburban sprawl. If we were to add 3 more, then how about this one? I do quite like that there are a few things to look at here, the terrestrial and the celestial. I think the juxtaposition of the guy on his stomach, the figures in the midground, and the angelic selfie in the distance creates some interest. Similarly, this creates a nice contrast between the stoic alabaster figure in the unicorn floaty and the precarious kid. I'm sure it says something about childhood. I very nearly said something to that little kid about bombing my shot, the little shit, but I'm okay with it how it turned out. Third was a bit of a toss-up, like, do I choose the warped Vivian Maier selfie or the leading lines of the shark net and the girl in the foreground? I mean, look at that sun hat. It was screaming out for portrait mode, but my fingers were just not nimble enough to turn her into an Art Nouveau poster. But I love a frame within a frame, so perhaps I'll just pick this one. I would have loved the feet in the corner to be on the other side, just to balance things out a bit, but hey, reality doesn't always play along with my creative vision. Speaking of reality though, let's not forget that this has all been interpreted through the lens of the Nikon 4500. And what can we say to sum up our experience with it? Well, firstly, with this camera, you could be forgiven for believing that reality gives a similar perspective to the back of a spoon because this thing distorts more than a Fox News editorial. Easily fixable though, so while it's a con, it's not DEF-CON 1. Other cons, well, there are a few. Starting with the trivial, the spring-loaded on-off switch, which is also right where the zoom lever is on a couple of my old film point-and-shoots, so I kept turning the camera off when I tried to zoom. User error, and I'll probably get used to it eventually, but annoying. Yes, it does chew batteries, though from what I could see from other reviews at the time, no worse than other cameras. Tied to that though is that it tends to shut itself off very quickly. You can change that in the settings for both the camera and the monitor, so you get to ride that fine line compromise between power drain and convenience. And of course, it's slow to start, slow to take pictures. The viewfinder is small, the LCD is small and dim. I mean, it's from 2002. 4 megapixel sensor, poor ISO performance, and perhaps the most noticeable flaw being that poor dynamic range and clipped highlights. And how about the pros? Well, despite the age of this camera, I'd say that the image quality is actually pretty good. It's nice enough for me not to want to fiddle around with TIFF files, and I'm a congenital TIFF fiddler, so decent JPEG performance was both a surprise and a bit of a relief. It has good macro performance, and that's great for capturing artistic textures and abstract shapes and things like that. One welcome feature is that it takes CF cards, which are far more compatible than some of the other proprietary formats around at the time. While the viewfinder isn't great, the fact that it does have an optical finder is critical for those bright sunny days where even with the newer cameras the LCD screen can be difficult to read. So well done Nikon, and I'm still waiting for OM System to bring out a new Olympus pen that actually has an optical viewfinder. It supports external flash, so you can potentially overcome some of those dynamic range problems if you know how to control light. And in fact, overall, this is a really well-specified camera, with lots of clever features built in. Some are pretty useless, to be honest. I can't see myself using keystoning for perspective control because it produces really ugly output compared to using something like Lightroom. But having advanced features like continuous autofocus, auto exposure lock, multiple metering modes, and high-speed shooting are all pretty useful. Take a look at the menu screen diagram of this camera and you can see just how replete it is. And some of these features can make up for the basic inadequacies of the camera. You can use exposure bracketing and combine files later to mitigate that dynamic range. You can also use Best Shot Selector, which tries to save the sharpest image out of a series to compensate for your hit rate with those dim, low ISO telephoto shots. And automatic noise reduction kicks in for long exposure to help remove hot pixels. So overall, it's a pretty good camera. And finally, yes, this thing does swivel. So lots of fun to be had with the Nikon Coolpix. We have made art, we have captured art, we have questioned the very essence of nature and its complex interaction with suburban sprawl. Now, you might think this sounds a little pretentious, but perhaps that's simply because the heady creative heights we're floating in can be a little bit dizzying at first. We are, after all, challenging assumptions of nature, beauty, and the meaning of life. And if you don't think of yourself as an artistic person, look, I understand. And there is actually a very simple solution to this. You just need to subscribe to this channel, keep coming back to join the community of creatives as we continue to push the boundaries of aesthetic photography together. Later.